All right, so I'm here with Devin Springer. Hey, Devin, could you maybe introduce yourself, where you're calling from, who you are, and what you're about?
Yeah, of course. And I want to thank you for having me on. It's a really big privilege to be on this podcast that I'm such a fan of. Like you said, my name is Devyn Springer. I'm a cultural worker, writer, artist, poet, as well as community organizer, prison abolitionist. I'm a Marxist Pan Africanist as well. In my heart, everything I do and say is for the liberation of Black people globally, as well as Indigenous people and all colonized people of the world. Um, I work with the Walter Rodney Foundation, which is based in Atlanta. We do political education surrounding Walter Rodney's work and related topics. And we hold a big symposium every year where we bring a bunch of speakers and we just engage in free political education throughout the year. So that's sort of my political home. Um, and I'm the host of the Groundings podcast as well. So that's a pretty short overview.
Yeah, it's a really amazing podcast. The work you do with the Walter Rodney Foundation is also really amazing. You get pegged as the quote unquote Rodney guy, but it's important work. um, but one thing that I'm really interested in, and sometimes I ask my people who come on the show this question, but how did you get politicized? Like, what was it? I mean, everyone has that kind of event in their life where they're like, they kind of set them down that path. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your politicization and how it informs your current work.
Yeah, and it's sort of this origin story question, right? Where everyone is has to think back and pinpoint their origin story as far as it goes politically. But I actually grew up in a pretty apolitical home, and it wasn't until high school where I mean, I've always known that I was black. Like that was never a question. Um, for myself and for my family and things like that. But it wasn't until I was in high school and there was a number of racist incidents that happened at my high school, and the school administration was doing nothing about it at all. And so me and a few other students decided we were going to have a protest. We watched some videos online of protests and thought we knew what we were doing. We tried to lock everyone in the lunchroom and force them to hear us, and it went very poorly. We were all sent to the principal's office. It didn't go over very well. But that was definitely my first taste of political organizing. And around that same time, I read Groundings by Walter Rodney and Asada Shakur's autobiography. I think it was maybe senior year of high school. And that's when I definitely started to, the things that I had observed around me, I finally had a language to put to them. Um, and then maybe a year or two later, I found the Walter Rodney Foundation, and that's been the trail that I've been on since.
And the reason why I invited you on the show is, I originally wanted to invite you on to maybe talk a little bit about Walter Rodney and how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and maybe we can do a show on that. And even his work, the Russian Revolution in the Third World, which is like a really amazing kind of collection of essays that really I actually found that was the first Rodney book I actually read, and it's a weird way to kind of go sideways into Rodney through that perspective, but it helped me kind of understand indigenous Marxism from the perspective of our own historical experience. But one thing that I have been following you is your journalism, and you wrote this piece that was published in the Independent, which is a UK paper or a UK outlet, and it's titled "Killer Mike, Ti, and Atlanta's Black Misleadership Class." And the premise of the article kind of outlines this event that happened amidst the uprising that was happening in Atlanta, but also nationwide, where rappers Killer Mike and Ti took the stage with Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance, all of whom are black, to denounce the Black Rebellion in the streets. And as you know, rapper Ti referred to Atlanta as Wakanda, the homeland of the Marvel superhero Black Panther. And next to him, a tearful like Killer Mike, who's like holding back tears the entire time, while also wearing a T-shirt that read "Kill Your Master," said, "quote We have to do better than burning down our own homes, because if we lose Atlanta, what else do we have?" And there's a lot going on here. Can you break it down? Atlanta is being described as this kind of mythical Black Emerald City, but who really owns Atlanta, and what is the situation on the ground here?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot going on. Even if you watch the video of the press conference that I'm referring to in the article, there's so much going on. It's very confusing. There was also, I think, Martin Luther King Jr.'s daughter was there, along with the mayor of Atlanta, Killer Mike and T.I. And it was the most politically confused, frustrating thing to watch as someone who grew up in Atlanta, who loves Atlanta, and who loves the black people in Atlanta, and who loves to see black people in Atlanta having this uprising in this moment, right? And so the point of the press conference with these rappers who are from Atlanta and who are sort of cultural icons of Atlanta was to stop the quote unquote riots, the the uprisings that saw property destroyed, quote unquote looting taking place. Things like this were the target of this press conference. Keisha Lance Bottoms, who is the mayor of Atlanta, gave a very impassioned speech where it almost sounded like she was talking down to her grandchildren. She was so angry. And I really just wanted to use this as an example to talk about the Black misleadership class, or these sort of sellouts, in a way of looking at it, as Walter Rodney would put it. But um, Killer Mike and T.I. essentially say we can't burn down our own homes. We don't do this here in Atlanta. The problem with that is, one, Black people don't really own Atlanta. We work in Atlanta, we make up the workforce and the working class of Atlanta, and there are our faces in representational positions in the government, the local government. But if you want to break down the numbers, we don't own Atlanta. I don't even, well, I guess I should say I don't even support necessarily the concept of private property. But if we want to look at it in those kind of terms, Black Atlantans make up the largest part of the workforce, but the lowest part of home ownership numbers, um, of small businesses, and then the large corporations like Home Depot, Coca Cola, Delta, they actually, and Chick fil A, I should say, they actually own the largest portions of land in Atlanta, along with the universities as well, who are who collaborate with these corporations, right? So the point is, we don't own Atlanta. The capitalists own Atlanta. So when he says, you know, you can't burn down your own home, I don't think any homes are being burned down. It's a plantation that's being burned down, right? If your people make up the workforce, but you own nothing around you, you own no means of production, that's a plantation, right? I mean, definitionally. Um, and so what I try to tap into is this idea that, and it's honestly an offensive idea, but because rappers have so much cultural pool in the black community, politicians are now calling on them to try and squash dissent and to try and keep protests quote unquote peaceful, even at the detriment of, you know, the black people who are fighting against our own oppression. Um, and of course, there's the irony of him wearing a shirt that says "Kill your masters," and then in a tearful speech, he tells everyone that, I think he said that his father and his brother, or his uncle and his brother, are both cops, and that he has a lot of police in his family. And to be honest with you, it just got weird. and uh, and then of course Ti calls Atlanta Wakanda, which, I mean, I was criticized for criticizing Black Panther because I knew this is exactly where we would end up. But Atlanta is not Wakanda. It's a real city with real black people and real black death. And I think that's the point that I was really trying to get at. I mean, they can say Atlanta's Wakanda, and we don't do that here. And he listed off tons of other cities and states and said that when you're not treated well there, you can always come to Atlanta as black people and feel safe. But that's just simply not true. We have dozens of people who have been brutalized and murdered by the Atlanta PD. Um, the jails in Atlanta are disproportionately black and Latino. I just want to name off and honor a few of the people killed by police in and around Atlanta real quick. There's Anthony Hill, Alexia Christian, Oscar Kane, Nicholas Thomas, Katherine Johnson, Jimmy Atchison, Deravis Rogers, Jamarian Robinson, and Kendrick Johnson. And you can't hear those names and simultaneously claim Atlanta as some black mecca, or I like how you put it, black emerald city, right? You can't have that disconnect and not address the tension between the two statements. Um, and so looking at this situation where we have these two rappers who hold a lot of cultural pull in Atlanta being called in, I think you can make a clear connection as well to colonialism, right? And this sort of establishment of cultural icons, administrators, and people giving small medial representational senses of power, but it's all at the intermediary between an oppressor and the masses, right? So these people are essentially the middle ground between uprising and, quote unquote, killing your masters, to use Killer Mike's own phrase on his shirt, and the actual masters themselves. That's the role these people are playing.
Right. Let's talk about that Black leadership class, which is a term that comes from the Black Agenda Report. And I encourage everyone who's listening to actually read Black Agenda Report, and especially to follow somebody like Glenn Ford. And, such a term might be easily dismissed on the grounds that it reinforces unhelpful categories such as like authenticity or perhaps essentialism. But at least as I understand it, it describes a class of people, as you were, gesturing towards, who represent the interests of the ruling class, right? They're doing the kind of cultural work, or they're doing the dirty work, essentially, of kind of tamping down any kind of anger or any kind of justified resentment towards the status quo. But Glenn Ford, the executive director or excuse me, the executive editor of Black Agenda Report, writes, quote, "The Black leadership class is not a scientific term. It is weaponized political terminology with specific meaning based on Black historical and current political realities. Most often in our usage at Black Agenda Report, the term refers to those Black political forces that emerged at the end of the 60s, eager to join the corporate and duopoly political, mostly Democratic ranks, and to sell out the interests of the overwhelmingly working class Black masses in the process. It is both an actual and aspirational class, which ultimately sees its interests as tied to those of US imperialism and its ruling circles. It seeks representation in the halls of corporate power and dreads social transformation, which would upset the class's carefully cultivated relationships with power," end quote. And I think what he's really saying here, and what you're saying, is like you actually need a class analysis of the United States as a colonial power. You can't understand colonialism without a class analysis, because class is fundamentally about power. And I think what happens in these moments, and we're kind of seeing this in these more kind of extreme versions of like race liberalism, right? We had we had
Hmm.
the Democratic leadership taking a knee, and they were wearing kentes, I think is what they're called.
Yeah, Kente.
Um,
Oh, God.
yeah, and it was such a performance, because
Yeah.
it was like one of those moments in which the people who are protesting literally have the power, right? It was like Justin Trudeau leading the climate justice march, right? It was like, who are you protesting? So I
Yeah,
was wondering if you can maybe unpack this term and why it's useful for understanding this current political moment.
absolutely. And I should say, when I first came across this term, Black misleadership class, I was hesitant because, I mean, when you sort of put this word class in there, you're doing something that has to be examined and that has to be really reasoned and thought out. Um, but the part where Glenn Ford, he says that it is both an actual and aspirational class, I thought that was very clarifying, in that this might not necessarily be an economic class, right, that we can sort of define in these rigid economic terms, but it is aspirational in that sense. And through it being aspirational, right, so through people like T.I. and Killer Mike, but also Mayor Bowser here in DC and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms in Atlanta themselves, through this aspiration, they are also sort of creating means for themselves to eventually be in that class, right? So I think that the word itself, I found it helpful to describing tension and to describing a certain phenomena that a lot of people had spoken about, but there wasn't necessarily a name for it. And I think that you hit the nail on the head saying that you have to have a class analysis and you have to understand the US as a settler colonial state to fully understand how the creation of this misleadership class happens. And I would go so far as to say this isn't specific to the Black community, it just may be more visible in the Black community. I think that there's in moments of uprising and angst, there suddenly appears, cultural saviors who are in close communication with the ruling class that want to quell dissent. I think that's not a new phenomena or a unique phenomenon to the Black community at all. It's just that because of the cultural capital that hip hop has and these rappers have, we're now able to really examine this in very transparent terms, I think. Um, but part of my understanding of this class is that it has to be in opposition with the working class sort of masses of Black people in elusive or almost hidden ways. So one of the examples that I would use is, or that I use in the piece actually, but is T.I. and Killer Mike both have songs that whose lyrics could be called radical, could be called even revolutionary at some points, the way they refer to Malcolm X and talk about police killings and capitalism even here and there. And they actually have to keep up that veneer, right? They have to keep up this sort of illusion of being part of the people and part of the masses and having this politic. They have to keep that up in order to remain in this misleadership class because part of misleadership is misguidance, right? It's sort of steering people another direction than to the left or then towards revolutionary means. And I think that component right there, Walter Rodney actually talks about how he uses South Africa for an example and how that throughout the experience of apartheid, there were Black South Africans who acted as intermediaries between the excuse me, between the Black masses and the apartheid rulers, and that this is actually a function of everywhere that colonialism or neocolonialism pops its head up. And there's also, of course, the analysis that Black people in the U.S. constitute its own nation, right? And if you look at it in those terms, and you look at the Black nation, quote unquote, then you also understand that there's a particular structure, I guess, to who is able to speak and what platforms they're given by the ruling class. So I think that I say all that just to say that I think this term, the Black misleadership class, introduces us language to discuss this phenomenon. And this sort of idea of misleadership is very important. And I like that you touched on this notion of authenticity and essentialism. And I would like to challenge readers to go and look up Trisha Rose. She's a brilliant hip hop scholar, but she actually talks about the notion of quote unquote authenticity in the Black community and how it's reverberated throughout hip hop and Black culture. And gets to the heart of that issue a little bit better than I ever could. but but yeah, so we can see this all around, and we can also see this with opportunist politicians. It doesn't have to be cultural workers and artists and rappers and these things, right? We can see someone, well, I won't say names, but I'll be nice, but there's we can see young popular politicians who hop onto radical language whose
Right.
actual policies and practices when they're voting in their Congress or whatever doesn't align at all with what they may be tweeting.
Right.
We can observe that across the board, right? So this idea of a misleadership class, I think it's actually a central component to understanding capitalism because I don't know any colonized or oppressed group who couldn't point to their misleadership sort of class representatives, right? I mean, even if you were to look at it in terms of TLGBTQ struggles, people point to the Human Rights Campaign and Ellen and a bunch of actors and celebrities as sort of the faces of quote unquote TLGBTQ progress and struggles, not someone like Miss Major, who is a trans woman who is Black trans woman who was there at the Stonewall riots, who is an anti-capitalist and who has great politics. They're pointing to other people who are usually celebrities who are in talks with the ruling class. So I think we can take this analysis and apply it to different oppressed or colonized groups.
Right. I have some friends and comrades, Jordan Camp, Christina Heatherton, and Manu Karuka, who have theorized this term, the dividends of multiculturalism, and it's kind of expanding on W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of like the psychological wages of whiteness, in like the Reconstruction era, and thinking about like how he did this really great class analysis of like of whites in the South, how there were the poor whites, and then there were the slave owners, and like how whiteness became a way to kind of level quote unquote class differences in that situation, and how whiteness became a mechanism to divide the white working class, or to unify the white working class, as if they had the same kind of interests. And what they say now is, in this moment of like neoliberal like multiculturalism, which are really big words, essentially like there's a buy-in to like to be part of this kind of this ruling class ideology. And so we saw this like in moments of the like, for example, the right-wing coup in Bolivia, where you had um Bolivians, ostensibly indigenous, who were becoming the voices of the coup that was happening against Evo Morales, who was democratically elected into power. But then also in the United States, you had like a group of queer studies scholars who were saying that somebody like Nicolas Maduro is anti-queer and therefore he must be overthrown, or this and that. And so in this moment in time, it's not just the kind of like the figure of the white person, whether they're a police officer or whether they're a representative of the state or ruling class ideology, but the buy-in to like be part of the settler society is to actually align oneself with U.S. imperialism. Um, and I was thinking about this when I was reading this, because artists and celebrities like Killer Mike and Ti epitomize a certain cultural phenomenon under capitalism that encompasses the entire culture industry. You can even point to Beyonce, using the imagery of the Black Panther Party, for example, at the Super Bowl halftime show, which if anyone knows anything about the NFL, it's like funded by the military industrial complex, right? While portraying themselves as something like outside or independent of mainstream culture, by endlessly repeating old gestures of rebellion and resistance, using familiar imagery and themes of Black rebellion, for example, to sell their music. They are, in fact, the dominant styles in the culture industry right now. It's the kind of cynicism of what the theorist Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, that there is no alternative to capitalism, and nothing runs better in the mainstream than a protest of the mainstream. And this is a way wokeness is not merely being co-opted by the ruling class; it is becoming definitively ruling class ideology. And Shell and Chevron, these oil companies, can say Black Lives Matter while plundering Africa. Can you describe the necessity of transcending the woke culture around anti-Blackness, and where African and Black Marxists and theorists can offer guidance in this moment and possible alternatives?
Yeah, I mean that's a hell of a question, but I'll do my best. I but I want to touch on. I like so looking at this in terms of capitalism, right? I have this sort of working theory that I'm still building, but what I call the representation economy, and it's essentially that neoliberalism and multicultural. I can't even say the word. Neo, Neoliberalism and multiculturalism have kind of had a child with this idea of quote unquote representation, and it's formed its own sub economy, right? That the sort of individualist and privatization logics of neoliberalism have merged so strongly with this diversity and inclusion, empty multicultural language that it is now itself, right? The very word representation is a profitable economy. I'm sure that if we were to go into the the marketing boardrooms of the top corporations right now, the word is diversity, inclusion, representation are on everyone's lips, right? Like this has now formed a sub economy where wherein representation is not a political entity anymore. Representation is a profitable entity, and there's a shift. And I think Lester K. Spence is a theorist who really helped me sort of form this idea of understanding neoliberalism as it relates to Black people. Um, but we now have this sort of economy of quote unquote representation, and what that does is now that there's sort of it's a sub economy of representation, it informs the superstructure, it informs the ideas and the thoughts and the logics of us, of society, of capitalist society specifically. So now that we know that this representation is codified as profitable, we can then understand how else it can be used, right? So part of that is stopping protests, part of that is misleadership, part of that is misguidance. And so I understand it as sort of almost the ultimate form of neoliberalism as we know it today, um, in terms of sort of socio-political logics. And to me, that explains partially how, like you said, Shell and Chevron can say Black Lives Matter while plundering Africa, or how, Apple can release a statement about Black Lives Matter while they're still using conflict minerals in the Congo that are harvested through slave labor, right? Um, I think this is not only the future that we're heading towards, but the future that we've been in for a while. We're just now really putting a magnifying glass to it. Um, and it's interesting to contrast this term representation, how it's used in neoliberal capitalism, versus somewhere like Cuba. So in Cuba's government structure, for example, it's the most quote unquote representational, maybe of anywhere in the world, as far as a quote unquote multi ethnic society. There are Black people, there are women, um, working class people, people of all different backgrounds and professions are all equally represented in the government structure. So when it comes time to vote, every neighborhood is heard, every community is heard, every quote unquote identity is heard. And that for them is what representation means. That's not to say that there's not a social and cultural sort of side to that, but the dominant argument around representation is not one of profit at all, right? There are issues, and there's sort of a new discussion around what representation means in their tourism industry and how that is starting to be whitewashed as European tourism returns to Cuba in the past decade. But when it comes to sort of political power, that's where they speak of representation. Even their actual system, they have neighborhood representatives who speak with provincial representatives, who speak with regional representatives, who speak with national representatives, who all have input into voting on things like constitutional referendums, right? So even from a geographic perspective, the rural, right? People who live in rural areas, people who live in neighborhoods that usually have no representation whatsoever, even incarcerated people, they're all heard, right? Versus here, when we say representation, we're thinking of a hijabi in a Nike ad. We're thinking of a queer couple in the U.S. military ad campaign. Um, and so representation, when it entangles with neoliberalism, it requires us to buy into this imperialist capitalist system in a multitude of ways. And so I think there are a lot of Black thinkers that help us think through that. I mentioned Lester K. Spence. He has a book called Knocking the Hustle Against the Neoliberal Turn in Black Politics. It's a profoundly wonderful book. I mentioned Trisha Rose. Although she's a hip hop scholar, her work is very sociological, in that it examines society, class, race, and the structures that combine to form hip hop as we know it in the industry around it. Um, and of course, Walter Rodney. For the listeners who don't know who Walter Rodney is, despite me and you mentioning him about a dozen times, Walter Rodney was a revolutionary from Guyana. He taught around the world. He traveled. He developed a very radical pedagogy model called Groundings. And it's a way of teaching where everyone is empowered and uplifted, very similar to Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And I actually want to read a short excerpt from what he said because he's speaking about colonial Africa and he's speaking about sort of the African continent, but I think it 100% applies to the situation for Black people in the U.S. and colonized people everywhere, right? So I want to read this excerpt real quick, if you don't mind. So he says in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he says, quote, during the colonial period, the forms of political subordination in Africa were obvious. There were governors, colonial officials, and police. In politically independent African states, the metropolitan capitalists have to ensure favorable political decisions by remote control. So they set up their political puppets in many parts of Africa, who shamelessly agree to compromise with the vicious apartheid regime of South Africa when their masters tell them to do so. The revolutionary writer Frantz Fanon has dealt scorchingly and at length with the question of the minority in Africa, which serves as the transmission line between the metropolitan capitalists and the dependencies in Africa. The importance of this group cannot be underestimated. The presence of a group of African sellouts is part of the definition of underdevelopment. Any diagnosis of underdevelopment in Africa will reveal not just low per capita income and protein deficiencies, but also the gentlemen who dance in Abidjan, Accra, and Kinshasa when music is played in Paris, London, and New York. And I think that's just a very profound way of saying it that there's a first off they define it as a minority group, right? So already they are defining it sort of as oppositional to the masses. Second, they say they dance in their African countries when music is played in the imperialist colonial nations, right? In Paris, London, and New York. They're essentially saying their desires are are not decolonization by any means. They're not liberatory by any means. Their desires are inextricably tied with or bonded with the desires of those who are in charge in Paris, London, and New York. But it's a euphemism or metaphor for the colonial world. So I think Walter Rodney is a great person to help us think this through as well, and how even though this was written a few decades ago, if we can tie and merge this in with a critique and understanding of neoliberal capitalism, we have we have language to discuss what's happening around us, right? Um, and of course, I think that different groups are coming to the realization of the emptiness of representation in their own way. So, for example, I'm someone who's Black, Muslim, and queer, and Black people for many generations have spoken out sort of about this misleadership class and the way that corporations will try and sell to us through sloganeering despite the actual material conditions that they put onto our communities. I think that the conversation for the TLGBTQ community is there, but it's still a little bit new, and it's still the critique is still being formed. I think that Muslims as well, Muslims in the West, um, have Nejma Sharif is a great writer who has written a lot about how this sort of Black Muslim aesthetic, how the aesthetics of Islam, how this fake love of Islam is being starting to be pushed into the media and is starting to become a dominant liberal narrative, despite these very same institutions bombing Muslim countries across the world. And not only bombing them across the world, but imprisoning us here and surveilling us here and spying on us here and murdering us here, right? Um, and so the alternatives to this is an understanding of representation that looks like what I described in Cuba. It's understanding that representation is about power. It's not about being seen. It's about having power. It's about the means of production. It's about agency and eventually self-determination. This is when you hear the Black Panthers, for example, the Black Panther Party and their newspapers speak about being represented and even running for local offices. They even speak about the fact that they know being seen won't change anything. It's the illusion of power. But when you can tap into an actual, representational, democratic, quote unquote, power, then the conversation gets rolling. And if you ask me, and I'll just end on this, if you ask me, we're never going to get that actual power within capitalism unless it is sort of built in our own institutions. And even then, it's a concession, if anything.
Yeah. You touched on a lot of like really, amazing and kind of pertinent issues. And I can think of the politics of recognition are huge in indigenous communities, especially for indigenous movements. And our like kind of litmus test is like Canada, which is like, this liberal empire, right? That's all about saying, oh, we're so sorry, and apologizing and doing all these things while incorporating indigenous peoples into like the colonial state structure in many ways. But also there's been several books written about it. Audra Simpson, who's a Ganawage Mohawk scholar, wrote a book called Mohawk Interruptus, and I think more like poignant to the politics of recognition using kind of the lens of Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks. Um, Glenn Coulthard, Glenn Coulthard's book, Red Skin, White Masks, is also kind of a challenge to how the kind of cultural recognition of indigenous people sidesteps the question of land, right? Sidesteps the question of like what decolonization means. And even that term is being, fought over in this particular political moment, because decolonization, becomes kind of a metaphor for, actual like material kind of changing of this particular system, or the overthrow of this particular system. And when you were talking about Cuba, I was thinking, and you mentioned briefly, you mentioned the superstructure, and it's important to kind of like dissect that term, because it's a Marxist term, and I actually think it's really useful. Some people might disagree with me, the base superstructure concept, because in the superstructure is where you get is the realm of ideology. It's where you get the institutions that uphold kind of the capitalist order. And I think culture specifically is a an expression of the superstructure, and the base itself is like the capitalist mode of production, or the capitalist kind of economy, or the capitalist kind of like accumulation of wealth, and the kind of expropriation of nature, right? And people as well. And I think about this in terms of how like indigenous people, we had a non-capitalist, and many African societies had a non-capitalist mode of production, right? And Rodney details this really beautifully in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I would disagree with him partially on one point, only to say that not all societies kind of tend towards capitalism. And I think people would, like argue that indigenous, societies, even though they maybe had some kind of elements of feudalism, it wasn't like a trajectory that it wasn't a natural trajectory that all societies developed towards capitalism. But nonetheless, we developed a robust, and by we I mean both African and indigenous peoples to this continent, developed a robust kind of like culture around non-capitalist modes of living, and that included like reverence for communal kind of societies. You saw this develop in the form of a new kind of anti-colonial, specifically anti-colonial kind of for a social formation called the Marooned Society. I would say that the Cuba itself is actually the result of Black uprisings, and then not so much here in the North, there's a tendency to whiten, right, revolutionaries in the South, right? Che was, he was just a European, or Fidel was just a European. But if you go anywhere in the Caribbean, if you go to like places like Venezuela, um, and you look at the imagery of Che and Fidel, or even if you go down to Bolivia with MAS, the movement towards socialism, they're darkening these two revolutionaries specifically, but also they're incorporating their own indigenous and African revolutionaries into their own revolutionary tradition. And these are movements towards socialism. Cuba is more kind of advanced in that kind of in that regard. But when you're talking about representation, you can't have that kind of representation that you're talking about. Whereas representation is about power, unless you overturn that kind of base that's informing the kind of superstructure. And I would say that using Rodney's work, using the Black radical tradition, but also the traditions within indigenous resistance movements, those are the real roots of socialism in the Americas, and you can point to all of these examples, specifically more so in Latin America than in the kind of northern Anglo North, right? And that's where I think like the real basis for a Black liberation and Indigenous liberation, resolves, not resolves, but finds itself. And Mariátegui, who was Jose Mariátegui, was a Marxist from Peru, who looked at kind of like we called it like Indo-socialism, and how the kind of non-capitalist modes of production produced these cultural norms within indigenous societies of communalism. And this isn't to over romanticize by any means, but nonetheless, we have those kind of remnants within our society, even in the global north, when we're hyper colonized and living in a hyper capitalist society. You see how like Black and Indigenous communities in the Anglo North are really the seedbeds of a post-capitalist society, or the kind of representation equals power that you're talking about. And I was wondering if maybe you could just like reflect on that, and like what are the possible intersections between Black and Indigenous liberation and decolonization. Because as you stated earlier, you were talking about this is a settler colony. Oftentimes there's an unuseful kind of binary between settler and native that doesn't include like other colonized people and other colonized populations such as Africans, but also the idea that African and Indigenous are somehow like mutually exclusive historical terms. And a place like the South is a perfect place to begin talking about power, who owns the land, et cetera. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts that you wanted to add before before we move on to the next question. I'm like asking these like huge questions. I really apologize.
No, it's okay. I enjoy it. I'm a fan. I think that, and I will shout out Tiffany King and her
Mm.
recent book, The Black
Hmm.
Shoal. It's called The Black Shoals: Offshore
Yep.
Formations of Black and Native Studies. And she actually really gets. I mean, she published a whole book on exactly this question of sort of the formations of quote unquote indigenous studies, and where blackness falls into that in the African continent. But so, okay, so a few things. I think that the base superstructure model that you described, I also find it very helpful. Um, but I also know that there are Marxists who have sort of pulled and pushed at it and sort of, you know, pushed our understanding of the base and superstructure, right? So I think of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian political prisoner and Marxist, Walter Rodney, and Stuart Hall are the three people who come to mind who made the concession that at times the superstructure, so the ideology of hegemony, can be so strong that it can sort of, influence the base in ways. Race being, I think, one of the main examples. Um, and and I think about that a lot in terms of what it means that a thought and an ideology and sort of really an ideological apparatus, I should say, just so people understand that I'm talking about like schools of thought, right? Like I'm talking about not just literally one thought one person had, but dominant ideas to a society. Um, but the base and the superstructure, I think one of the most important things that a mentor of mine always taught me was they're always in conversation, not explicitly, of course, but they're always they're in constant movement. They're never static, even when you think or can feel like it is. And if an analysis looks at them in static terms, then then uh, that's where an analysis becomes quickly irrelevant. Um, in my opinion, I guess I should say. But nonetheless, I think that there is so Frantz Fanon is a thinker who I think through a lot with this question of decolonization and representation. For those listening, Frantz Fanon is he was from the small island of Martinique. He was an African revolutionary who one of the most profound thinkers to ever exist, in my opinion. But he helps us think through this question of decolonization. Some of his books are um, Black Skin, White Mask, The Wretched of the Earth, Towards the African Revolution. I feel like I'm forgetting one more, A Dying Colonialism as well. Um, but he sort of helps us think through this notion of what I call the Black misleadership class, but these representative bodies whose politics are at opposition with the masses. Um, and he really helps us think through this idea of the petty bourgeois, people who are not quite the quote unquote ruling class, but who do have a stake in the capitalist system, who do have capital in some sense, or who I don't know how you would define the petty bourgeois in such a in like a few sentences, but um, so he helps us think through, and part of the idea for me is understanding that there is a place for them if and when it comes time for decolonization, because they are in the position that they are in. Um, for example, I think of someone being a doctor, and maybe owning a house or two. That is, let me back up. I'm getting lost.
I was like, wait, are you going to defend landlords? No, I'm just kidding.
No, 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 not at all. That's why I'm like, let me back up. The point I'm saying is this petty bourgeois class, they what small resources they have can be used towards revolutionary means if
Right,
they are willing to give it up. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think that Friends Fanone is someone who helps us think through that.
right.
Kind of talked myself in a circle there. But so when I think of decolonization, you know, I mean, I think of it in material terms. I know that some people online will say things like decolonize anime or decolonize pop music, or I don't know, but I think it's related to land. I think it's related to resources and land and the means of production. You know, who runs, not even just who runs the state, but actually the actual sort of parameters and structures of the state themselves, the universities, right? Repealing things. It's decolonization is a lot, but it's also uprising. It's also rebuilding and restructuring, and sort of in the Sankofa sense, a return to the source. Um, and so I think that this black representation question has a lot to do with decolonization, because we can look at the history of revolutions in the world, and we can look at the history of decolonization movements in the world, and many of them have been influenced by this petty bourgeois class, by members of this petty bourgeois class, I should say, who have lended themselves and their resources and given them up to the struggle. Um, Che Guevara himself was a Marxist doctor and physician, right? And that, because he was this physician, Cuba's healthcare system was established and to this day remains revolutionary. They intentionally wanted to repeal the ways that the colonial structure had left out Afro-Cubans and Cubans living in rural areas, right? They intentionally had that framework and idea because he was oriented in a certain way. Now, the question of will how many of these sort of members of this class will actually do that is a whole nother question. That's a larger discussion, where you'll get 10 different answers if you ask 10 different people. But that's sort of, I guess that's what I have to say on this, your question of the relationship between uh, Black and Indigenous representation and decolonization, right? We have to look at history, and I think history shows that not there is, but there can be a purpose for this class, right? Should they choose. Um, and if they don't, the masses always outnumber them. And I'm sorry to say that bluntly and covertly at the same time, but the masses will always outnumber this minority class, quote unquote, as Walter Rodney puts it.
But there's the, you referenced Gramsci, and I think Gramsci is useful in thinking about like the role of intellectuals. And oftentimes, we think of intellectuals as just like humanities scholars, and that's not the truth, right? Like you pointed out, che Guevara and everything. I think of Antonio Gramsci, his theory of the intellectual, and I think it actually begins the prison notebooks with this. And the intellectual plays like an important role. And I think there's this confusion even among people who want to understand, the role of the intellectual within a revolutionary movement. Oftentimes people look to the organic intellectual. The organic intellectual is neither revolutionary, nor are they like inherently reactionary. And organic intellectuals, they develop their sort of like kind of class position within they could be like entrepreneurs, right, for the capitalist class. They could be people who are innovators. They could be engineers. They could be, community organizers, or whatever. But they develop organically their kind of like intellectualism from their very kind of social position within a society. And then you have the traditional intellectuals, such as myself, who work at a university. They're trained, and they kind of undergo this kind of rigorous process of like, being validated by what are essentially feudal institutions, right? And then at the same time, you have the people who are union organizers, are people who are part of like a revolutionary Marxist party, and they try to merge, or they try to fuse the kind of like professionalism of the traditional intellectual class with the kind of organic reach of the organic intellectual into what they call like a new intellectual, somebody who understands and challenges the status quo, or the capitalist kind of like ideology, or the capitalist mode of production. And I think, looking at Fanon, and like Fanon was writing at a time, he was actually pushing back against a lot of his his upbringing within this kind of like left circle in the Caribbean. But also he was, it was really fascinating. He's an internationalist, right? And like by today's standards, if like Fanon, he became a revolution, or he didn't become a revolutionary, but he participated in an anti-colonial revolution in Algeria, because he was a Marxist, and he was he's a communist internationalist. And if you even read his like library, like the books that he had like so much Mao in his library, right? He was very influenced by Mao's thought and thinking in the Third World Revolution. But somebody like Fanon, he doesn't, just because he's a psychiatrist, doesn't naturally lend himself to be a part of the kind of the revolutionary intellectual class, right? Of this of the Algerian Revolution. He had to like join a party. He had to be part of a revolutionary movement to actually fuse his knowledge of psychiatry. And I always recommend people, like, everyone reads On Violence and Wretched of the Earth, but nobody reads the kind of latter half of that book, where he's doing these case studies of the colonial police, the French police, but also people who are participating in the revolution, where he really fleshes out kind of his ideas. And I guess where I'm going with all of this is to say that like there is a place for the so-called petty bourgeoisie, but it's not a natural kind of tendency where like, they're just going to automatically align or naturally align. People say that, oh, we're natural allies. It's not true. There's nothing natural about capitalism. There's nothing natural about these social positions that we're in. You actually need to go outside of them and organize with communities. And we're kind of running out of time, but I really appreciated that kind of breakdown. But I want to ask a final question.
Well, I was
What?
can
Oh, go
I
ahead.
was I want to respond to the intellectual question real quick. I know it's so fascinating that you bring that aspect up, because last year I published this article in a journal with Dr. Jesse Benjamin, and it's actually, once again, Walter Rodney, but it's Walter Rodney had a concept of what he called the guerrilla intellectual. And he actually has a book that's one of his least read books, but it's called Walter Rodney Speaks: The Making of an African Intellectual. And it's a series of interviews with him that were collected over 2 nights while he was in Atlanta at the Institute of the Black World. And he's being interviewed by very incredible people like C.T. Vivian, Sylvia Winter, and these kind of people. But he comes up with this concept of the guerrilla intellectual. And for me, it was one of the most illuminating and sort of useful uh, creations, right, in this sort of idea of thinking and talking about intellectuals. I know that prior there's Cornel West, and he spoke a lot in a Gramscian, inspired by Gramsci, uh, about the idea of an intellectual and what an organic intellectual means for the Black community. But I think Walter Rodney, in his idea of a guerrilla intellectual, he pretty much defines it as someone who understands their purpose and understands that they are in a university to subvert it first and foremost, right? Like they are in there at the expense of others, possibly. Therefore, they have a duty. The black intellectual, but this can be applied to other colonized groups, has a duty to actually subvert the tools of knowledge production, of political education, of the archive, all these resources that are at the disposal of people who are in the university. They actually have a duty and a position where they're able to subvert it, to expropriate. So he uses the word, I love the way he uses the word expropriate. So expropriate the actual means of knowledge production, right? The fact that you have access to these resources, and and understanding your role as being like almost like destiny. I don't even know a better word to use it, but that you are required almost to be this guerrilla intellectual and to struggle alongside and to be in constant communication with organizers and revolutionaries on the ground if you aren't one yourself. And I think that that ascription and that sort of way of looking at it is really powerful. And I was trying to find an excerpt in the essay to read, but I'm just not going to worry about that right now. But he he's inspired by he says that he's inspired by Lenin and Cabral and Mao, because these are people who weren't just thinking, but they were also doing. And he sort of refers to this idea that that capitalist academia and all of his professors and teachers had told him you had to pick one or the other, and that for him coming to the realization that you can and should do both, and in fact revolutions occur when you do both, was him sort of coming to the realization of what it means to be a guerrilla intellectual. So I just wanted to plug that concept and idea, and I hope people listening can definitely Google and search guerrilla intellectual, because it's a great construct and a great way of sort of framing this idea of an organic intellectual, or
Mm.
public intellectual as well.
Yeah, that's I'm gonna go back and read that. I've never even heard of this book, so I'm gonna check it out. And it reminds me of the conversation that I have with a lot of my students, especially my grad students, is like the kind of moral, just the moral and political responsibility somebody has as being like a student, or somebody who's attending a university within the United States. It's like the United States, if you want to talk about monopoly capital, right, has accumulated all the social wealth, or most of the social wealth, a good portion of the social wealth, right, which makes it an imperialist nation of the entire world. People are impoverished so that you can sit in a classroom. You aren't, personally responsible for the impoverishment and the immiseration of the entire planet, but that social wealth has been accumulated so you can be here. What is your political commitment? What is your moral responsibility? Because if you're going to go out there and just become a stenographer for the State Department, or a stenographer for U.S. imperialism, you're doing a disservice for the rest of the world. And especially as like people who are colonized intellectuals who come from even my own background, I like at the time I graduated high school, there was a 75% dropout rate for native students in my home state, right? And I was one of 17 native students to enter college at the university that I went to, the University of South Dakota, and I was the only one to graduate from that college. So it was like a 4% like graduation rate in college. And I understand my position and the privilege that I have. And privilege, like we can talk about privilege politics, but there is a legal basis for privilege. There is a class basis for privilege. But understanding that and having that like honest conversation of what intellectuals within the academy can do and can't do, and what we actually should be doing, is something that often gets sidestepped for like career advancement, for cultural capital. And I'll just say straight up, this podcast does nothing for to advance my career. In fact, I get hate mail for this
Yeah,
podcast.
me too. I've lost opportunities because of interviews I've done on my
Yeah,
podcast.
exactly. You had this person, they're I don't know, I won't even get into the details. but
Yeah,
um but I really appreciate that. And like it's something I'm always confronting and I'm always tangling with. I never think you should be comfortable as an intellectual. It means that you've actually ossified your way of thinking. If somehow you find yourself being comfortable, waking up with like a clear conscience someday, because there is no clear conscience, right? I think that's like the kind of dialectical method. Anyways, um, I want to get to this last question because it's something, I follow your Twitter account and I respect a lot of the work that you do, especially the things that you write. And you seem to have a your finger on the pulse of what's happening, and I just want to know from your perspective, like what is distinct about this moment from the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter uprisings that we experienced in the last decade, right? And what is the same? And what are the limits of spontaneous uprisings or decentralized, quote unquote, leaderless movements? And what's possible in this moment? What's not? And where should we be looking in terms of leadership?
Hmm, profound question right there. I mean, I think that, so the first part of sort of what's different and what's the same in this moment right now. I think what's different is that the amount of, well, one thing that's different. There's a lot of things that are different, but one thing that's different is that the amount of international solidarity um, has been outstanding. I mean, we have seen huge protests in, ironically enough, tons of European countries who have their own problems they're ignoring, right? But but also, like, a lot of people might not know that all of the African embassies here in DC issued statements to the U.S. government of solidarity with Black people in the U.S., saying that the U.S. government needs to reckon with what they're doing. Um, there have been statements made to the UN and these sort of international bodies. Whatever that may be worth is not my decision to say. Um, so I think that part of it is that there's just this international solidarity. I mean, we even saw protests in Palestine where protesters were marching with Black Lives Matter signs with the names of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd on them, right? Um, and so I think that in this moment, looking at that international solidarity as compared to maybe a few years ago when this movement for Black lives was first popping off, the international solidarity was there, but I feel like the I don't know if it's because of the pandemic or what, but I think that the international class conscious is a little bit higher right now in that there's so much material support. I mean, I've had calls from comrades in South Africa, Cuba, and Palestine all in the last week, all asking, where they can raise funds to donate to, giving me advice on how to deal with tear gas, because I've been tear gassed like 4 times in the past week alone. Um, Giving me, advice about medical history and things like, I mean, just even if it's unuseful, just the fact that they're trying, you know what I mean, shows that to me, this moment is really different. I think the other aspect is that the push towards abolition, right? Abolition of the structures of policing and prisons in the US, that push is stronger than ever. The dominant reframe, the dominant demand around the country is defund the police. Obviously, I would say defund the police is not the same thing as abolish the police, but it's a hell of a start. From in just a span of about 4 or 5 years, the phrase Black Lives Matter was controversial. People didn't even want to affirm the sort of the humanity of Black lives. People didn't even want to post on Facebook Black Lives Matter. To now, there's open calls to defund the police, and there's city councils who are taking it seriously, and there are politicians and capitalists who are shaking in their boots right now because it continues to gain traction. So I think that's part of it. I think another part that really makes this distinct is the quote unquote riots, which I call uprisings. I think that we spoke a lot about Frantz Fanon, and he speaks a lot about violence and how, in many ways, decolonization and revolution necessitate violence on some forms. But I think that the destruction of property, right, which matters more than Black lives to the capitalists, has created a almost visceral reaction. And it is, whereas at one point this sort of solely quote unquote non-violent movement was able to be ignored, it's forging space and forcing it to a place where it cannot be ignored. And I think that that in itself is distinct, because you can't turn on the TV, you can't scroll down Twitter without seeing dozens of videos of cops brutalizing protesters with batons, tear gas, or just beating the shit out of protesters with their fists, right? Like you can't turn away from it at this point. This is sort of the reality that Black people have lived in for about 400 years now, and I think that now there is finally some semblance of a reckoning with that. So, in this moment right now, I think what's possible is that the abolitionist call. Well, so I'll put it like this. I told a friend a few days ago on the phone, Jared Ware, JB Ware on Twitter. He's a good friend of mine, brilliant abolitionist. But I said I
Host
feel
of
like
Millennials Are Killing Capitalism too.
yes, co-host of Millennials Appealing Capitalism, great podcast. Um, but I told him this feels like if we look at abolition, in stages, I feel like we just advance to a new stage because of the virality of this call to defund police. And even though people are now saying all kinds of things are abolition that actually are not abolition, we now have so many more people at least willing to come to our side and coming to our side. So I think that what's possible in this moment is it's twofold, right? It's possible that more people are coming to abolition, but it also means that we on the left and we as sort of revolutionary thinkers, intellectuals, abolitionists, organizers, we have a duty to guide and direct political education that can align with the spontaneous uprisings, right? Like I don't think that they're in opposition with each other, the spontaneity and sort of organizational structure. I think that millions of people hitting to the streets and just being mad as hell and knowing why they're mad and targeting these beacons of capitalism, targeting, banks, Starbucks, police, all these different things, that actually doesn't hurt this organizational structure and this sort of organizational leadership model or whatever you want to call it. I think they actually work together because we need both of those. We need both of those to move forward. Um, and for your last point on where we should be looking in terms of leadership, I think we should be looking to the streets. I think that the people in Minnesota, you people probably to this like right now probably don't know the names of some of the activists who actually were behind what has what has happened in Minnesota and what has been accomplished in just the past week or two. People might not even know their names and faces, and I think that's actually okay because I think they, in sort of refuting this creation of more celebrity activists, they they are creating new forms of leadership that really rely on the masses and on this sort of this reverberation of energy in the streets, right? Like I think we should be looking to the masses, and as part of the working class masses, we should be looking to ourselves and our sort of. I think Angela Davis says we find our strength in collectives and collectivities, and so I think that that's where we have to look for leadership. And so far, it's working. I mean, we've pushed the national conversation away from reforms that DeRay and company want people to take in.
Talk
And
about Black misleadership class.
that, the blue vest misleadership class. But let me
The
let
blue
me stop.
checkmark, blue vest.
Let me stop before I get a cease and desist from a lawyer. But
Oh no.
but anyways, the point is, I think that when we're talking about leadership, I think that the masses, if we couple the spontaneous energy that has happened and that has already profoundly changed the course of this nation, if we couple that with organizational structure, we're going to be unstoppable. And I think we're on the way towards it right now.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way to put it, and I really appreciate it. It actually helps, clarify in my mind the way I've been thinking about things because, the tendency in my head is to really think about how can institutions, sustainable kind of like long-term institutions be built out of this, and really like you can't predict in moments like this what's going to happen next. And I really appreciate that perspective. And I think it's a really good place to end it. And for folks who are listening for the first time about your work, where can they find your work? How can they follow you? And how can they support the work that you're doing?
You can find me on social media, Twitter and Instagram at Half Atlanta, HALFATLANTA. To support my work, just support the work that's happening in the streets, donate to a bail fund, speak with incarcerated people, get a pen pal. If you want to support my work, support abolition and organizing.
Well, thanks so much, Devin, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.